Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. So you're getting ready to listen on a real treat, because this second video is where we begin to read the first thing that we're going to read before we go into the Platonic Dialogues, which is the article that Chris and John Vervaeke wrote called, I think it's Gnosis in the Second Person, which I think serves to, it's beautifully written. I mean, it's so good. It's one of those things where it's like what it takes to comprehend it is enacting the very thing that you're comprehending. And that continual hermeneutic, I think it's poric revelation of it. And so I want to just encourage you to read along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to upload the paper to a Google Doc, and then I'll put it below, so you can find that below, and you can read along with us if you want. Some housekeeping things. So in terms of events for the Circling Institute, which is my company, because of the coronavirus, we are going to be moving some of our events to online. So, before you drive off to the event, please make sure and check out our Facebook page. We'll give you information on how to, where not to go and how to get online. We'll be doing some things on Zoom, and it'll be an experiment for us because we've been such an in-person participatory company. So this will be an experiment in that, and in a way that'll keep us all from spreading the virus. Also, if you are interested in coaching with me, email me. My email's below. And I think that's it. So enjoy the first of, I'm sure, of 1,000 videos in the series, because it'll probably, I don't know if we'll be able to complete this reading of the dialogues in our lifetime. But I'm looking forward to dying trying. All right. Have a really good day, and thanks for tuning
in. Right? And instead of contributing to the deconstructive project of trying to veer us away from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some of deconstruction is kind of doing that almost perniciously. And some of it, I think, is more innocently trying to grapple with a problem that we inherited. Mm-hmm. So they're not all the same, but right. Yeah, it's just, yeah, the magnitude of that problem is just like, crushing.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of visual symbol. I just pressed record, by the way.
Okay.
I should just probably do that from now on, because
we should just probably do that from now on.
Yeah, totally. To do that. But just so welcome to my screen, and I welcome myself to your screen.
Welcome to my screen.
Yeah. It's not as flat, I would think, but I've often had this. I've had this thought about, wouldn't it be interesting to like, you had a sitcom, right? And it's just a sitcom about something, right? And then all of a sudden, one of the characters notices that it's on a flat screen of light. Somehow it figured it out, right? So all of a sudden it realizes that, oh my God, all this stuff about dimensions, and there's me and you, there's actually just this flat screen, and I'm being watched by another thing. Mm-hmm. Like, what would happen to the rest of the narrative? Like, would he be just kind of give everything up and just work at Starbucks and just be fascinated by the drip of the coffee, realizing it's everything? Would he start a religion and try to like get other people to like trick them into seeing that they're a flat?
It would become that's basically sounds like a quintessentially Gnostic quest, that it would sort of, it would trip the motivation to somehow to somehow be emancipated from the flat screen, right? It would begin a quest to basically work your way out of the predicament.
Right. And like at one point would it lose grasp that it, like, would it forget? And then would it be able to tell that it forgot? Right. And then would it go on the whole thing of like it, it realizing that it got so, attached.
Yeah.
And it didn't realize its attachment made it more or the illusion than the illusion itself. It's funny. Right. You just go in all these different directions.
That's
I had one time when I was when Brienne and I were home all weekend or something, and we watched all the Matrix videos. I had this idea. I was like, it'd be interesting to kind of play this game of where we think about each one of our friends, and we think about for each of them, what would it take for them to like realize that they were in the Matrix? Like what kind of angle would you have to go into? And it's so funny, it was like we would talk about each person. It's like, oh, this person, like, it would be so hard for them, but like, why? Like, how do you know it would be so hard, and who would it be easy, and what angle would you go into? And it's so interesting how personality and character kind of came to light. And I was like, wouldn't that be a fascinating game? And Brienne's like, don't you call that circling? I was like, oh. I like.
Well, what a relief to realize that you're in the right place, doing the right thing.
Yes. Very funny.
Then to abstract away from who and what you are in situ, and to find yourself right back where you started and realize, oh, well, I want to be doing this because this is what I'm doing.
Absolutely.
Did you find when you did that exercise together, did you find that you shared the same intuitions about the people that you ran through?
Yeah, that's what's interesting is, we talk about Bob, and it's like, oh, and it was so clear to both of us, Bob, you could never.
Bob would be oblivious,
like
right?
He would just be so suspicious, right? Or whatever. You'd get all these characterology, these psychological character traits. You'd have to like, and this kind of goes to the existentialist psychologist thing, that character on some level is your project against death, your particular way of defending against dying. Right. That's right.
Yes. Well, because like it's true to that that Heraclitus maxim, right, of character being destiny, character being determinate of all things. I mean, that's sort of the essence of really good classic drama, especially classic tragedy, is that character predestines the fate of all persons, right, and that the fundamental change in character portends a change in destiny. And it kind of ties back to that little fun exercise you were talking about a moment ago, about a character realizing that they were on the wrong side of a flat screened boundary, and then craving emancipation from it, because it makes me, because that is a traditionally dramatic device, right? I mean, right back to the Greek chorus, the idea that there is an awareness beyond the enclosed perspective of the character undertaking the journey, that whose refrain brings the view from above, right? The perspective from without. And when it does happen, and the breaking the fourth wall, as it were, in a drama can be a little bit of a gimmick thing to do. But those that do it well, there's a show right now called Fleabag. It's on one of the streaming services. I think it's on Amazon. Anyway, it's about a young woman in London, and it's just about her life, more or less. It's been very lauded, and deservedly so, because it's like fiercely witty drama. And it's basically about a person who goes, from day to day, from moment to moment, and has a constant refrain to the fourth wall, right? She looks into you as the audience. But rather than that just being a delivery mechanism for exposition or something like that, or a way of a character being able to choose scenery, what it becomes is it reveals an appetite for an extrinsic perspective to help deliver her from the confines of her predicaments and her ethical and moral dilemmas on a day-to-day basis. It's like so the audience looking in is like the representation of a third factor, the spirit from without, the perspective that exceeds that of the character, but that they so desperately crave. And there's one character at one point in the show who notices, and this is really interesting, who notices that she keeps gesturing herself to that third factor, that she keeps gesturing herself outside of the bounded world in which she exists, and that a character is able to notice that about her becomes the kindling for intimacy and for a kind of mutual knowing that she's been deprived of in her other relationships. So there's something so observant about this that the sort of the beckoning of that choral perspective that exists outside the bounded frame of her life in situ, that the recognition of that appetite is synonymous in the narrative with a kind of recognition of her. Almost like a sensibility transcendence that occurs because of someone noticing that deep, that felt lack that manifests as that constant gesture to outside.
Somebody else noticing it, and that becomes one. It's interesting. It becomes they notice what's beyond her, yet calls to her, and then she probably feels seen.
Yes.
But what's seen is what's somehow beyond her.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
yes, exactly.
There's that. What is it? As we're probably going to read in a second.
Yes. Yes.
What is it? The onto? It's a
onto intimation.
Onto intimation.
kind of. Yeah.
And so
exactly.
she kind of, in a certain sense, in a way, rations, right, toward that relationship.
She does.
Right? Because that person
does.
Exactly. Like the after image or the pre-image almost.
Exactly. Because that person's perspective of her relates not simply to her, but relates to her in potentia, right? Relates to a force that verbalizes her from without, that remains in the margins of her possibility. And that is what the person starts to attend to, which is true of our close and intimate relationships, even friendships, right? Do that as well. If someone sees you for what you can become, in addition to who you are by constraints of your necessity, then already that means that the affordances of that relationship are multitudinous. They amount to much more than what you are in the confines of actuality at any given moment, which is how you know you have something really valuable between you.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. Because I've always had that sense of people talk about, in circling, they talk about this experience of being deeply seen. And like, and kind of in being deeply seen, they recognize the rarity of how seen deprived they've been. But I've always had this sense of like, seen seems to constitute this kind of sense of like, there's something that you are, and that it has not been visible to anybody, and then you see it.
Right.
But actually, I've never known. That's not the experience of being seen. On some level, there's a sense in which the thing. It's almost like the very thing. It's almost the reason why you do anything at all, right? That's actually concealed in its comings and goings and what people relate to. It's being related to like, oh, I see what you couldn't have seen in yourself, but you see it in the moment that I say it, that has been the thing that has pulled you forward, and then I feel seen. It's very interesting. Very interesting. It also
because then the partners in the process become conspirators for its poiesis, right? They conspire to pronounce it, to reveal it, to bring it forth, and to be like they become causative of it in a way, right? Even though it lay already in the offing of possibility in that conversation, they called it forth. They helped to verbalize it.
It's kind of getting me. It's interesting because there is this quality, and this is one of the things that the circling practice has been it struck me about how people really consolidate when that which is unseen is coming to be seen. There is this quality where everyone is drawn in, and it's almost like they have to say it. Like everyone's drawn, it's almost like a kind of a strange kind of prayer in a way, right? Or a declarative sense that everyone goes into this sense where you're looking at something and like it's like there's this thing that's just out of concealment, right? And there's like a must be said.
Yes. Yes. And yeah, exactly. And all it needs is to be informed with the proper attention. I mean, it reminds me of the famous metaphor that Plotinus uses for the sculpture, right? That the treatment of one's soul, that the crafting of one's soul, and the gilding of the matter of the person with form is as the process of sculpting marble, because what you're ultimately doing is you're at least phenomenologically, you're working to pronounce something that is already there but concealed by its matter. Yeah. And so you're collaborating in the process of informing the matter. And of course we can do that interiorly. There's a process in which, and that is a dialectical and dialogic process, which maybe we'll segue into the chapter, but that's a dialogical process of pronunciation of the form that's there, right, concealed beneath the forgetfulness, concealed beneath forgotten. And so that process of sculpting, that process of the techne of the soul, as it were, is an interior process, but of course it's also trained and conditioned by the exterior dialogue and dialectical processes that we have between us. So we're co-sculpting in addition to sculpting each in his own interiority.
And
that's it too. And then there's a chiasma. They cross too. Those two processes intersect, and the point at which they intersect is the point of it. That's the horizon of intelligibility that's retreating away as we burrow more closely into ourselves and more closely into one another.
Yes. Yeah. That horizon of intelligibility that's retreating away as we burrow into what's most close to us. I think that's the big insight that, Heidegger really brings to light and that's directly that space that's lost in his notion of the technology, the age of technology, is that he talks about that what gets concealed in the technological way of being, right, is concealment itself, right? We no longer can sense, in other words, it's kind of a hyper figurizing, like the moment the background is at the moment it's captured and utilized and abstracted to the point where the only thing that we see as real, as having being, is that which we can abstract out of, right? Foreground, right? So this sense of the presence of withdrawal or concealment as something that's actually has being, right, is the very thing that's concealed. So concealment is concealing, right? And that's part of the things that makes, like we were talking about earlier, about how quickly there are just huge generational changes in what designates as counting as reality, right? It's happening so fast that it's hard to even for the previous generation to conceive of that something's different, right?
Right.
because it's such a drastic change. But it's all the change is, when you step back from it and you look at it, it's uncanny in its weirdness, right? But what makes it so uncanny is that it doesn't occur as uncanny. Like, that's the thing. And that's, I think, that loop of where you don't know, like, you have these life-changing, inventions that happen, like our phone, and within like a few days, you don't notice it anymore. And yet you're shaped and fashioned by it. But that fashioning of it actually conceals it, right? So it's so interesting. So this is one of the things I'm excited, and I think the reason why I keep getting excited about what we're doing here is that it seems like the Socratic dialogues are, in some sense, if there's anybody that can hold open concealment, right? And almost kind of torture you with it, right? Socrates, right? The struggle and
he's holding open the aperture for the rest of us.
Yeah.
So that the light can come through.
Yeah. So there's
like
a way,
proverbially, like the cave, from the mouth of the cave, as it were.
Right. So just kind of it's just interesting to think about this, that like you and I are going to read these dialogues that are 2,000 years old or something, over that. And they're inherently going to not be immediately entertaining, right? It's, in fact, the opposite of entertaining in many respects. It's going to be a struggle, and it's not going to make sense, right? Yet, imagining people encountering this and following along, it's probably going to strike it. It's going to be so foreign to even see that as valuable, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But but it's there, in some way, it's kind of like the opposite of technology in that sense. It's not collapsing distances. It's actually wisdom, finding wisdom, right, in precisely what isn't immediately useful or immediately intelligible. But in a certain sense, that sense of being, zeroing in on the figure, and in those moments opening the ground in which was concealed, and in realizing that going through that whole process that did that the ground flashes forth, right? And that's something like the cultivation or the attunement to wisdom, is really becoming rare and rare and rare. To even see that kind of process as virtuous is really going away at a level that it's hard to even see.
That's right. That's exactly, that's well put. And I think part of that is the we're so unappreciative of ignorance, our own ignorance. I mean, we sometimes appreciate ignorance in other people if it seems to vindicate our own, or we seem all the more smug by comparison or something like that. But being unappreciative of our own ignorance, I think, is a particular virtue that we've lost. To be able to look out at a scape of knowledge, knowing that you're not equal to it, but having a sense of trust, even something promissory, a sense of trust that with the time and energy and a certain discipline, that you might actually be able to traverse the scape, right? To appreciate, like, appreciation in advance of acquisition is, I think, a particular virtue of pedagogy that I think has largely been forgotten and lost. Right. And it's most important in areas, domains of knowledge, domains of knowing that are not immediately comprehensible, such as those that we've brought here to our table: philosophy, first and foremost, chiefly, and of course, religion, theology, etc. I sometimes, the hastening to the presumption of knowledge that happens, like, systemically and so commonly in education settings to say, we're going to sit down and we're going to read this. And the hastening to comprehension is something that educators, I think, are just as guilty for, to say, you know, we're going to have this session and you're going to expect to understand this after a period of study, after a period of reading, when in fact, nothing could be further from the truth, right? If you're made to subscribe to the notion that you can acquire this knowledge expeditiously or within a bounded period of time, you're going to lose interest and you're going to lose humility in one fell swoop. Why is this worth my time? And why is this worth my, you know, why should I humble myself before something that is so finite and foreclosed to me? Yeah. Right. You know, and I think that's that's true of the study of philosophy, but I think it's even more true of anything that approaches theology or studies of religion. There's a presumption that this can be digested swiftly. And it's like, no, it can't. No, you need to sit with this. And that's where the importance of gnosis comes in as a reframing of the definition of knowing. That's why gnosis is so important, because the experiential imperative of gnosis, the conformity of knower to the being known that gnosis implies, it comes with a premeditation of humility, because until you are absorbed into what you claim to know, you do not know it. And that lack of appreciation in every sense of the term, as a way of foreclosing domains that are voluminous, but that seem at their surface negligible, you know.
So as Heidegger would say, I seek you to move from confusion, hopefully, to being utterly perplexed.
Yes, exactly.
I don't want to relieve your confusion, but I want to move you from confusion to being perplexed.
Exactly. I want to induce your disorientation so that you acquire an appetite for orientation that's fuller and more appreciative. And once I do that, then maybe I'll have laid the conditions for something approximating an education. That's the Socratic project too, right? That's the whole purpose of the Apparatic Elenchus, is to deprive people of their propositional certainty, so that their knowing can be transmuted into an experiential domain that is fundamentally without the comforts of certitude.
Yes, totally, and almost have awaken the eros, the desire for
exactly
for that which you don't understand.
Like that eros, possessed of eros, both as a lack and as an appetite.
Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that is that's great. I'm glad we're doing this.
Yes, likewise.
So
should we
crack the article?
Let's crack open the article. So here's my thinking, and we can do this however you like. I should say, maybe for anyone who might be watching, we attempted this the other day, but my internet connection was so sluggish that we had to abandon the project, abort the mission. But we're giving this another try. So maybe I think maybe what we'll do is I can start reading it, and then, you know, you can maybe just stop me whenever you want to stop and sort of start to annotate, or start to sort of prompt with any questions and that kind of thing. How does that sound? What do you think?
Sounds great. And what I'll do is I'll upload this to a Google Doc, so people can access it and read along if they want with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we said this in the last video, but I should probably repeat the fact that this is a draft chapter, a contribution to an anthology on an anthology of metamodernism, which is to say, sort of a project of cultural reorientation, is what I understand it to be. My understanding is very abridged, though. I'm not a metamodern per se, and I shouldn't be taken as a representative. But my sense is it's sort of it's a collection of exploratory attitudes or inquiries that are trying to take some of the more relevant criticisms of postmodernism seriously, but also hearkening back to traditions, antecedent traditions of antiquity that still have the capacity to inform us and to not think of those as simply failed and defunct projects. So it's a gesture back and a gesture forward simultaneously. That's my sense of what metamodernism is in a nutshell. Anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of setting that to the side. This is a chapter that's contributing to an anthology of those kinds of exploratory provocations, I guess you could call them, by John Vervaeke and I. And it's still in review, so it could change. But yeah, so that's my disclaimer.
Totally. I thought it would be great. My idea was to read this first before, to set context, to bring, because so much of that paper is about the dialogues of Plato, and particularly the Socratic Dialogos that you described there as a necessary to situate us in our times, right? And
right,
like it really brings it down into, takes it out of, ancient abstraction, right? To actually it's perhaps more pertinent than it's ever been. I'm going to put it on pause because I need to grab some water.
Okay.
And then we can start Zoom. Okay, we're recording.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead and start reading, and then I'll just read, and then I'll just kind of stop you at certain.
Just interject as you see fit.
Absolutely.
Okay. And like interject with comments too, Guy. Like a lot of, as we go along, one hopes if we've done our job properly, then a lot of the nomenclature, a lot of the sort of the definitional work is done in the paper itself. So I'll try to avoid being redundant, as we're annotating from without. But if you want to interject with just comments or anything, you go ahead.
Okay, great.
Okay. So the title of the chapter is Gnosis in the Second Person, Responding to the Meaning Crisis and the Socratic Quest of Authentic Dialogue. And this is by John Vervaeke and myself. And there's a quote to open the paper, which is a quote from Plotinus: "Knowing is the organ fitted to the object." Quite simply. Okay, and then there's some acknowledgments, and I'll make note of the acknowledgments because they're particularly relevant right now. The authors extend warm thanks to Guy Sengstock and Jordan Hall. Your midwifery was invaluable in the delivery of these arguments, and your dialogic partnership is evidence of the spiritual survival of Plato's Academy. And so anyone who has seen our four-way dialogoi between you and I and John and Jordan Hall will implicitly know that reference. And I think just by reading the paper, I will have demonstrated why those acknowledgments are so well deserved.
Right. And I'm going to put an email to all of us for the next one.
Perfect. Okay, so this is divided into a few parts. The first part is called Dialectic and the Four Ways of Knowing. The introduction is titled The Postmodern Predicament and the Loss of the Second Person. It now seems obvious, even trite, to say that modern sociability has lost its art of conversation. Postmodernism has long embraced a diffuse normativity, and Western culture is an endless vivisecting of tribal fragments, mitoses of single-celled identities inflating their certitudes to systems of signification. Awash in parochial meanings, then, our instruments for meaning-making seem untuned by the common discourse, as if we lacked the forms of interaction that allowed us to concert projects of authentic and collective development. The loss of authentic dialogue is a peculiar obliquity of our ethos, where the convictions of knowing pendulate between subjective, first person, and objective, third person, ontologies, until they become idols of egoic possession that we trade, defend, and brandish for identity. This idolatrous knowing has atomized our senses of self, space, time, and community, and has us subsisting in stillborn encounters unwed by modal confusions of relating. That is, by the having of relations over a being in relation to the world. The pre-modern world might be unavailable, but the postmodern world is infrangible. We need only look to the tenor of public debate to see that the state of discourse is afflicted with performative contradictions and victories of self-defeat, a despairing desire to be as a part, but only by prevailing in triumph. The self-defeating discourse is but one pathology of the modern meaning crisis, and the one to which this chapter will attempt a concerting response. The response begins with a proposal that discussion, like any cardinal virtue, is a techne, a craft that can be fostered or frittered. When fostered, discussion can become dialogos, a practice of onto-intimation, there's your word, Guy, that discursively disciplines our existential attitudes by arranging our loves to seek self-transformation. And the authentic...
By the way, stay tuned in because onto-intimation is a very sexy word. Okay.
So I should say, maybe I'll interpose myself into this for a moment. Onto-intimation is a term. Philosophers sometimes, I'm not calling myself a philosopher in saying this, but philosophers tend to take liberties by constructing diction in order to accommodate more complex concepts, and that involves portmanteaus and a lot of other creative liberties. So John and I very knowingly took a little bit of a creative and a philosophic liberty in this term onto-intimation, trying to capture and enfold a lot of things that are otherwise not conjunctive together in this one term. So hopefully it will become evident why that particular hyphenated combination is descriptive in this case. Okay. In the authentic discourse, you cannot know without also being known, cannot be known without also being changed, and cannot be changed without changing your capacity to know. This second-order appreciation becomes a developmental imperative. Dialogos is, among other things, a socialized training in self-transcendence. And in the Socratic tradition, it was cultivated in the second person, with a pedagogic partner that cared for your authentic soul and taught you to care in the character of his knowing. This chapter will argue that the metamodern quest to rediscover authentic dialogue begins with this pedagogy, and that by typologizing the ways of our knowing, we can begin to adapt the praxis of Socratic dialogos back into common discourse. Fortuitously, the emergence of 4E cognitive science, which is to say embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended, has yielded new theories of extended mind, distributed cognition, and the emergence of psychotechnologies, socialized systems of representation that bootstrap metacognition and allow us to enculture collective forms of second-order thinking. These psychotechnologies have equipped us to disambiguate the process of knowing, to formulate accounts of intelligence, rationality, and wisdom, to mobilize a response to the meaning crisis. A new form of authentic dialoguing will be incomplete without a comprehending system of propositions, enacted by procedures, embodied by perspectives, embedded in participation. A system of participatory knowing can help the dialogic quest to turn intelligence, individual and collective, into rationality, and rationality into wisdom. Inspired by the Socratic and Platonic tradition, we will refer to this fostering system of knowing as the dialectic. This investigation into Socratic Platonic dialectic is intended as a motivating model and cognitive template for critically explicating, elucidating, and encouraging the emerging practices of authentic discourse and relating.
Right. This is, so I just want to highlight pull this out, because I think one of the big things that I really got out of this, so these first two opening paragraphs, is just I really love the way that you formulated the problem, right? In that there's, if we say that there's, first person present, right? Then there's second position other, right? And then there's like kind of the God's eye view or the third perspective. And that if you just think about it, that there's something that's going on in our time where the sense of the second person, right, is gone. So all we're left with is the third, like these ideologies in many respects about what's objectively true, right? And my perspective and how I do or don't fit in it, and how you do or don't fit in it. But it's the elimination of seeing it as process, which is a little bit like what we were talking about. I think it's at that sense in which we're seeing it like this particular generation doesn't understand or presuppose the distinction of character, right? Where character is usually defined by having gone through a process, doing hard things, going through, and that you develop through a process of having lived for a long time, and you end up knowing things that you couldn't have known earlier. And
right.
And so there, in a certain way, there's, and also I really like the thing that you said about that quality of, I think where you could see that this a lot is that I am based on my identity, right? All of this like extreme talk about like, ethnic identities, cultural identities, that there's this kind of this sense of that there's these pre-given things that you are either a part of or are not a part of, right?
Right.
And they're unquestionable, like that they are as they are, in that sense of that you become through a process or engagement is losing its telos for us.
Right.
So in some ways you're kind of setting up the problem of like, well, let's actually return back to dialogue. Let's return how one becomes through the relation, becomes who one is through it and beyond it, right? Yes.
Well put. Very well put.
All right.
Shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay. So the next section is called the Dialectic Vocabulary, Logos, Gnosis, and Rationality. It is increasingly difficult to invoke the Socratic and Platonic traditions without sinking to the quagmire of modern lexicology. Terms like knowledge, reason, and rationality had been dulled by the abrasions of materialism. Enlightenment thinkers abridged episteme from the original understanding or interstanding to fact acquisition, rationality from the Latin ratio to dispassionate logicality, and logos to univocal purports. Such notional astigmatisms are culpable for many modern cul-de-sacs, an inheritance of obsolete epistemologies premised on refracted accounts of knowing. Suffice to say, a meta-modern rehabilitation of any of the above is no small undertaking, and in a fit of aspiration, this chapter will endeavor to model the rehabilitation in addition to arguing for it. The use of the term aspiration here is technical, termed by Agnes Callard to mean a proleptic rationality, not calculative arguments, but a cultivated view from above that changes the identity of a subject as he comes to know what he could not imagine knowing, and so comes to be whom he could not imagine being. This self-transcendence requires a notion of rationality that emphasizes the amelioration of self-deception, the affordance of aspiration, and the subordination of argumentation to the telos of personal transformation. Dialectic reasons that, quote, a man who has learned anything becomes in each case such as his knowledge makes him, end quote, from the Gorgias, Plato's Gorgias. And to this end, aspiration is the deployment of attention to our epistemic maturation. The view from above is a relation we adopt to raise us as we go to understand it. Philosophia, in the tradition of Socrates, was a dialectic system for practicing proleptic rationality. The loving of wisdom, so defined, put us in a relation of wondering aspiration.
Right. So would that be wondering aspiration, in interstanding and words like interstanding, philosophia, practicing proleptic rationality is another great word.
Proleptic rationality, and that's Callard's term. That John has adapted into some of his videos and lectures, and we've adapted into this work because it gives breadth to the definition of rationality such that it's able to accommodate the characterology that you were just describing. What is rational oftentimes is not simply a kind of dispassionate calculation at any given moment in time. What is ultimately rational by this more Platonic definition is whatever will lay the conditions for one's transformation such that we will become more and more accommodating and adaptive to experience and more able to flourish through it, right? And so what is rational then becomes whatever will change us and regather us around ever deeper and more encompassing problems.
Right.
Which relates back to the idea of gnosis, right? The conformed knowing, having to regather, having to be reconstituted around the objects of your attention, around the objects of your knowing. And I mean object in an abstractive sense. I don't mean object in a material sense.
Right. That would be something like, when you're sensing into something and you have a hunch or something grabs your attention, but you don't know what it is, but it still grabs you. It's like there's the horizon, and then there's the thing that draws you towards the horizon, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying is that it's Socrates attunes attention, right? And the relations to continually look for what it can't make object, right?
Right. For what it can. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah. For what it can't yet make object, to attend to what it can't yet make object. Okay. I mean, by analogy, we might say, and by analogy is not a dismissal, quite the contrary, and that'll become obvious in the next section when we talk a little bit more about analogy, the role of the analog. But by analogy, we might think of it as, I'm taking this as a sort of a Vygotskian example that John uses quite often about the relationship between the parent and the child, that the child obeys the wishes of the parent, not because the child can rationalize himself around those decisions, because the child can't rationalize himself or herself around the parent's decisions, because they encompass variables and dimensions of experience that are foreign and as yet unknown to the child. So the child isn't beholden to the wishes of the parent because the child has reasoned his way around their problem in any comprehensible sense, right? Yes. The parent's rationality in adopting to the wishes of the parent is a deeper and proleptic kind of trust.
Right.
Now there's obviously there's more at play in the child's obedience to the parent than proleptic rationality. But that's what I mean by it being an analogy. That imagine that the child's the trust that the child entrusts the parent because the perspective of the parent is completely supersessive to the perspective of the child.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so entrusting to the superordinating perspective, even if your own perspective can't quite, isn't ultimately, even if it's sort of, if it's beyond your ken, as it were, you're entrusting yourself to something that's, that can contain a perspective that you're not able to contain.
Yes, and that you can have a relationship to that which you can't totally understand, but it can glow to you in such a way that it grants the normativity of rationing, right? And so that would be an example, the parent-child relationship. And it seems like it would also be something about when you're just getting to know somebody and you fall in love with them, right? There's that quality of inexhaustibleness that when you're in love with somebody, that there's so much more than, and there's an awareness. In fact, the erotic impulse of diving in seems to be directly related to that. There's so much more than I can actually see, right?
Right. That's right.
The loving and the enactment of the falling in love and moving towards you are all, in some sense, that sense of what's beyond what I can see, but I can be constituted by it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're entrusting yourself to the depths that are sure to transform you.
Yeah.
Right. And that Marx, that's Kierkegaard talked about that a little bit when he talks about sort of the idea of the night of faith, right? That at some point you reach a threshold beyond which you can no longer reliably gather and retrieve a concrete normativity. And so then the process of the ontological entrusting that you have to place in what is unbounded is sort of it's an inevitable part of the process of self-transcendence and transformation, and that also is what makes it subject to self-deception as well, right? Understanding when to entrust yourself to the incomprehensible depths,
right,
and then beyond which you can no longer see clearly is precisely the question. And that's where the training and the education and the mentorship comes in, right? That's why Socrates is the mediating figure, because Socrates conditions the trust from, we're going to talk about this later in the paper too, right? But from one proposition to another in a series of graduating steps, Socrates carefully trains the trust and earns the trust of his interlocutors, so that when he dissolves their dialogos into aporia and moves to effect the reorientation, he has already earned plausible trust in the trading of propositions thus far to have his authority be very rational, even if the move he's making isn't intelligible to each of the individual participants. I trust you because you've earned my trust thus far. Therefore, I can plausibly entrust you with this that I cannot understand.
Yeah. Well,
so there's a pragmatism. There's a tinge of pragmatism to this as well, obviously, right?
Yeah, Well, I think one of the things that just kind of struck me is there's a move that happened inside of me in understanding this. I want to see if I can articulate. There's one thing in being able to respond to what's beyond the horizon that I can't make object. But that's also can be very self-deceptive. So it's another thing to have the wisdom to be able to that's fascinating. To have the wisdom to be able to apprehend on some level what thing that I can't make object is the right thing that will lead me to a wise place. Like that ability is a whole other level of education. And it's funny, I get the sense of that there's, one of the things about our time is there's a big loss of mentorship, or the idea of mentorship, right? Where there is this quality, having been mentored myself, there is this quality of where there's kind of like what they're saying, the mentor's saying to you explicitly, right? They're telling you, where to put your hands and how to do it. But there's this whole other level of the way that they're participating with you and the participation that they're called, that there's a meta intelligibility to the way that they use their hands, the way that they're you that are somehow in the background, but end up being the very thing that gives you the intelligibility that you notice later, usually a lot later, that you can then attribute it to that mentorship. That's right. Participation element of it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that participatory element of it is itself, it's itself enabled by the dramaturgy of there's a reason why there's a mimetic process in play with these dialogues, right? That's the whole idea of internalizing the sage, internalizing the Socratic figure. Isn't that you're simply isn't that it's not simply that the mode of inquiry is conferred on you. It's that the manner and the attitudinal, the composure of the inquiry is also conferred on you. And that's why it's so dramaturgical, because you're playing the role. It's the playing of the role that espouses the training of the wisdom, right? It's stepping into the footfalls of the Socratic figure. Right. It's not so it's not simply that because you're right. It's something deeper than whatever straightforward instruction you're given. It's an attitudinal absorption of the person.
Yeah.
That grants you the latitude in your own identity to be able to assume and host ever more of their perspective.
Assume
right?
and host. Wow, interesting.
Right? So playing the role of Socrates, and I mean, this happened, and artists tend to report this a lot, right? I'm thinking of authors who are writing characters or actors that are playing a character on stage often report the fact that if they're in the flow state, I should qualify that to say if they're in the flow state and they're playing a certain character, whether simply giving voice in a literary medium or actually embodying a character in a theatrical medium, they find themselves suddenly equipped to speak with a voice that resounds beyond their own. In other words, they can conceive as the character can conceive, and as they could not outside the bounds of the character, right? So there's something about the process of play. And I mean, a lot of people, right, from Piaget onward, developmentally talked about the role of this and how important it is and how indispensable it is. But that's one thing. And that's also, I mean, as if we need something to dignify and qualify how vital those kinds of art forms are to us, because the art forms that allow us to extend identification are the same art forms that actually allow us to condition the sense of play that endows us with the capacity to seek self-transformation genuinely and authentically, because it prevents the ossification of identity that happens when we're constantly vacillating from the first to the third person. If I am simply an object I own to be possessed or dispossessed of, then I will not be ever verbalized from without in a way that seems spontaneous and unanticipated. And it is the spontaneous and unanticipated emergence of oneself in the throes of something ritual, in the throes of something poetic and creative, that rebirths the potential of how we can understand ourselves and anything writ large, right? Again, the gnosis is inseminated by the play. And that's why the Platonic dialogues are dialogues. That's one of the reasons, clearly, why the Platonic dialogues are dialogues, because they ritualize the dramaturgy of role play that is actually necessary for the acquisition of the Socratic persona so that we can actually act through it appropriately.
Yeah. That's just so interesting. I just, this thing about host the role. It's like I can host a party, right? In a certain sense, like I can host a party and have people come over that I'm not yet capable of knowing how to host. But in the hosting, I'm drawn forth into realizing the conversations and the intelligibility and like in this way that I will consciously probably say, oh yeah, I learned this and I learned that, but yet it will come through at levels that I can recognize, after I host parties after that, right? There's a sense of
that's right,
being impregnated with the sense of a potential or a possibility that on some level I can apprehend as worth it to host it. Yet that in some way, yes, that sense of the host becomes what's hosted. And
that's right. You are played by the role that you're also playing. You are played by the role that you're also playing, and then the way that you comport the way that you comport yourself and your credulity towards that role, I think also matters, because then if you overplay the role, as it were, or over identify yourself with the role, then you get the classic inflation of the persona that Jung talks about, right? And then if you're endlessly divested from the role and non-committal and not entreated to play, then you're never going to get the sense of experimentation with your identity that's ultimately going to yield the margins that you can then grow into and through. And so it's the simultaneous identity and disidentity, and that's why John and I talk about it as a state of translucency, right? That you're seeing and seeing through simultaneously. You're seeing the role and you're seeing through the role. And that means that you can maintain the tension of that state of play without completely dissolving into it and in a way completely losing yourself in it and being incapable of then exchanging or extricating yourself from it.
Right.
But you're also committed enough to be properly embodied within its analogic functions. And that's why that state of tension between belief and disbelief, identity and disidentity, represented by the idea of being translucent, is so, I think, very, very essential to this idea.
Yeah. So, wow, this is great. It's great. Probably should do maybe one more paragraph, and then maybe we should. It's probably getting over an hour and a half at this point.
Yeah, it's gonna. I had a suspicion that with I say this with no chagrin whatsoever, but I had a suspicion that it would take us forever to do this, and that's okay.
Oh yeah. It'd be great for.
Okay, one more paragraph it is. The loving of wisdom, so defined, put us in a relation of wondering aspiration. Okay, in Philosophia, the efficacy of dialectic rationality is inseparable from its dialogical format. Yet the meaning of dialogos requires a more exacting definition of logos. A term like realization is more commensurate with the etymologies of logos as a conceptual gathering or putting in order. It refers to a functional organization, a fittedness for purpose that disposes an efficient mimetic relation to reality, like the extract of an ontological pattern applied as a probative implement. The idea of gathering. Go ahead, Guy.
What is mimetic? Remind me what mimetic means.
Mimetic, like mimesis, which is imitation.
Okay, got it. Great.
Yeah. Applied as a probative implement. The idea of gathering intelligibility saw some revival among the pragmatists, who proposed that the meaning of a concept was constituted by its, quote, conceivable bearing upon the conduct of life. That's a quote from Charles Peirce. For example, the pencil is writable, or the chair is sittable. For many of the pragmatists, logos was a sharpening approximation of the real that appreciated in reality, a hypothesis that realized by the texture of an individual's ongoing contact with the world, which recursively deepened his ontological grasp. Centuries earlier, Plotinus introduced a similarly tactile metaphor to describe the knowing of Gnosis, a grasping fist that gathers to its object and tightens into verisimilitude. Appreciation, there's that word again, at once meaning gratitude, apprehension, and graduation of this grasp is the function of proleptic rationality, not as applied to knowledge, that is, to information, but to understanding, which grasps the plausible significance of information by its relevance to our aspired possibility. Proleptic rationality educates logos through disciplined discussion to gather itself around the highest order of potential for any intelligible unit of knowledge. In other words, proleptic rationality has us appreciate information based on how the information makes us more rationally appreciative, casts us in deeper conformity with reality. This is the significance of the dialectic project, appreciating logos with an aspiring gnosis that espouses shared identity with ontos, being. Dialectic. Go ahead, Guy.
I just want to read that again because there's a lot to appreciate here. This is the significance of the dialectic project. Appreciating logos with an aspiring gnosis that espouses shared identity with ontos, being. Wow.
I know there's a lot. There's a lot folded in here.
No longer. I start that sentence one person, and by the end, I'm someone else.
Believe me, Guy, I feel the same.
Yes, I can't imagine what it was like to write that. Okay, cool. I just want to write that down and appreciate that for a second.
Dialectic is the praxis that seeks to engender and enhance the process of dialogos. Socrates advances the dialectic project by conducing, through dialogue, a percipient weddedness between the knower and the being known that becomes a symbolized relation, an embodied binding that affects transjective knowing, a flowing state of being that opens a current of phenomenological continuity between a subject and her object. This is dialogos. Symbols, from the Greek symbolon, join entities into a shared identity and induce this transjective current like a conductor induces an electric one.
Wow.
This current of transjectivity is participatory. It synchronizes the other ways of knowing into a patterned similitude. This cognitive synchronization is fundamental to Plato's Philosophia. If Socrates is the conductor of knowing, his dialogues are its circuitry. Dialectic signifies the, quote, current that expresses the nature of truth as concealed, as requiring search in the direction of a self that is not yet known, close quote. That's Abel Rape. I hope I'm saying her name right. Really incredible books on Socrates and Plato. Our aspired continuity with this yet unknown self and the world it beholds was symbolized by the Socratic eros, intimating the apotheosized aspect of man that would later emerge through Neoplatonism and Christianity, in what Andrew Stang calls our divine double. Quote, our divine.
Right.
And I should say, it's noted in the paper itself, but I should say John, in his series, An Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, has one of his videos more or less devoted. He has also a couple of conversational videos devoted to this topic, but one of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series is on specifically Corbin and the divine double.
Yeah.
Or the divine. Corbin calls it an angel, I believe. His idea of the imaginal angel. Anyway, yeah.
Divine double. You want to read the rest of that paragraph? Or wait a minute, or that
that's the end of the paragraph.
Okay, guys.
I did as instructed. Should I keep
No.
Should I stop there, or what do you think?
Let's see. Let's just check it out for a second. So I think what I'm appreciating is one, through reading this, is one, this is really ecstatic to understand. I'm like reading this along and I'm feeling like kind of jolted along in these kind of like euphorias of things coming together. So I just want to appreciate the way that this is written. And so there's a technical precision, but it gathers so much more than you can technically account for in the way that it's written. So I just really want to appreciate you for being the kind of being that you are, such that that something like this gets to exist. It's really great.
Thank you.
And I think one of the things that's interesting to me about this is what's hitting me is that I can recognize everything that you're talking about. Like it hits a note that's just so, it sings as true. And I think the truth that it sings to is that there's a logos to our being, right? And our relationship to the world and the way the world is and the way I am in relationship to it, that it's in our machinery for this to happen. It's like, it's hard not to feel, it's very difficult to feel cynical about reality when you recognize that this can be possible without you having to construct it, that you're of it. I mean, it's a sense of trust and faith I feel in that this is possible, right?
That's right.
Wondrous.
That's right. Yeah, the idea that it's an endogenous or intrinsic feature of your normativity, something that simply awaits your recognition, awaits your remembrance of it.
Right.
It's a very humbling thing to just the notion of it is you're right. The notion of it is ecstatic unto itself, because you realize quite simply that you are beyond yourself. You
Yes.
are ever beyond yourself. You always have been beyond yourself.
And
that you are a relation that awaits consummation in some sense.
And that what it takes to understand that is the very thing that's being understood, right?
Exactly.
That's that hermeneutic, those circles, those ever-evolving circles. It's really, really, really great.
That's right.
That I just love that. I don't know. There's something for me that just like where that, and that seems to be characteristic of dialogos and of these deeper conversations, right? Where there is that implicit recognition that like the very thing that we're inside of that we didn't notice in like conceiving of it, we recognize that we're inside of it without having had to know it, right? And there's that,
right, the
birth of that, the logos, the gathering and what's gathered, and you dwell in the gathering. Right. This, it's I think I'm appreciating why Heidegger like first tried to go into this in terms of temporality, because it's
totally, yeah,
right, the sense of ecstatic temporality is so much more apt to accurately reckon with our being, like Dasein, human being, right? Is we're not, God, to look at us in terms of an atomite kind of subject in a space that then acts. It's like that stuff just falls apart when you look at it. What is it to actually be, right? There's like some level, and I think there's some history to this too, because my understanding, this, if we say that Hegel was a kind of culmination of a system, right? Like one of the things that I've appreciated about Johannes is like how he says, like, look, you can't add anything to Hegel's system, right? It's
immaculate.
It's immaculate. And it's almost the culmination of the actual trumping the possible. And in that sense, it misses, conceals, right? And so in some way, there's a sense of slipping that back out. And if we say no, the possible is what animates and calls us to be way more.
And animates is the perfect word for it, right? It's the imbuing with anima. It's the imbuing with soul. It's the gilding. It's the enchantment of actuality by possibility. Kierkegaard calls it something like a transubstantiation of experience. That the way in which we read actuality, it's the kind of phenomenological literacy that we're trying to retrain and re-educate, so that we read into actuality with a perspective that enchants its being.
Right. Wow. So good. So good. So glad we're doing this.
As am I.
All right, my friend. So this is our first official, well, it's not our first official video, but it's the first one where we're actually doing together. So
that's right. The first one where we're not just talking about doing it.
Yes. I will post this, and I'll make sure and do a little video beforehand to set up some context. And
okay. Yeah. Okay. And hopefully when we come to do the next one, I'm not going to have to pilfer internet. I'll actually have it at home. Boy, what a saga it's been. Anyway, thank you for being patient with me.
Yes.
As I wrestle with technology.
Absolutely. It's nice to be patient with you, and it's nice to be co-patients with each other. All right, my friend.
Thank you, my friend. Talk to you soon. Bye.